Welcome, dear viewers, to the Family Shadows channel. No one could have expected that a lavish party celebrating my husband's promotion to managing director would turn into a night where my in-laws frantically called my phone over 80 times. But what I will remember forever isn't the relentless ringing of the phone. It was the exact moment my mother-in-law pointed her finger directly at my parents' faces and shouted in front of dozens of distinguished guests, "My house is packed. You two get out to the kitchen and eat there." The entire crowded house suddenly fell dead silent. My parents stood there, paralyzed. My husband lowered his head, but I just laughed. A very faint laugh, but it was the laugh of someone who had just decided to end years of biting her tongue and enduring humiliation. I took my parents' hands and walked straight out of my in-laws' house, right through the shocked gazes of the entire extended family. An hour later, as my parents were sitting in a VIP private room at a five-star downtown restaurant, looking at a luxurious menu they had never dared to imagine, back at my in-laws' house, the lights blared all night, phones rang off the hook, and the sounds of crying and yelling echoed through their halls. From that very second, they finally began to understand exactly who it was they never should have insulted. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in front of the mirror for a very long time. The dress I wore wasn't a designer brand, but it was new. I chose a modest, understated color because I knew my place in this house perfectly well. A daughter-in-law who was accepted, but never truly respected. Outside in the living room, the sounds of boisterous laughter and chatter echoed. My in-laws' house was more crowded today than ever. Extra tables had been brought in, fresh, crisp linens draped over them, and the entire first floor of the estate was filled with catered food. On the wall hung a massive, gleaming banner. "Congratulations on your promotion to managing director." My husband, the man of the hour, stood in the center of the crowd, a glass of champagne in his hand, smiling endlessly. He nodded to every congratulation and beamed at every compliment. I watched him from afar, feeling neither particularly happy nor sad, just a profound, unnameable emptiness. Around 5 p.m., my parents arrived. I spotted them immediately from the front gate. My dad was wearing his old, faded plaid shirt. He had ironed the collar meticulously, but it still couldn't hide his rural, working-class background. My mom wore a simple pastel cardigan, her hair neatly tied back, carrying a rustic wooden basket filled with goods from their farm. Freshly picked apples, homemade preserves, and sweet corn. I knew that basket held my parents' entire heart. They stood at the imposing wrought iron gates of my in-laws' estate for a moment, looking inside awkwardly, as if afraid they were stepping into a world they didn't belong in. I rushed out to greet them. "Mom, Dad? Come on in." My mom smiled gently and nodded, while my dad let out a soft cough to hide his shyness. The moment they stepped through the front door, my mother-in-law's gaze locked onto them. Without a word being spoken, I could feel it. Her eyes swept my parents from head to toe, paused on the rustic basket of farm produce, and her lips curled into a cold smirk. "Oh, the in-laws are here early, aren't they?" Her voice wasn't loud or harsh, but it was so icy it made me shiver. My mother replied politely, "Yes, ma'am. We came early to see if we could help with anything." My mother-in-law waved her hand dismissively. "No need. It's crowded enough as it is. Coming early just puts you in the way." With that, she turned and walked off, leaving my parents standing awkwardly in the middle of the crowded living room, surrounded by people in tailored suits and cocktail dresses, laughing and talking loudly. I quickly pulled up a couple of chairs for my parents to sit temporarily in a quiet corner. But just a moment later, my mother-in-law walked back over. "The main dining tables are full," she said, her tone absolute. "We need to leave those seats for the corporate executives and the immediate family. There's some space left back in the caterer's kitchen. Go down there and sit. It'll be easier." I froze. The kitchen, the place where the catering staff was cooking, where the hired help was rushing back and forth, was the place she had designated for my parents on this important day. I turned to look at my husband. He stood nearby, swirling the wine in his glass, averting his eyes. He didn't object. He didn't defend them. He merely muttered a sentence so quietly that only I could hear, "Come on, honey, the house is full, don't make a scene." That sentence felt like a blunt knife. It wasn't sharp, but it cut incredibly deep. My dad stood up first. He forced a smile. "It's all right, sweetheart. The kitchen is fine." My mom didn't say a word. She just lowered her head, hugged the heavy farm basket tightly against her chest, and followed my dad. I watched my dad slightly hunched back, and my mom's trembling hand gripping the hem of his jacket. My throat choked up. In that split second, I suddenly realized If I didn't speak up today, then for the rest of their lives, my parents would always be the people in the kitchen in the eyes of my in-laws. I stood completely still in the middle of the noisy living room, surrounded by the clinking of crystal glasses and congratulatory cheers. But all I could hear ringing in my ears was her voice. My house is packed. And right then, deep in my heart, a silent decision was made. My in-laws' prep kitchen was located at the back of the house, separated from the main living areas by heavy swinging doors. It was a space designed strictly for cooking, for hired help to move in and out, never a place for guests to dine. Yet today, my parents were shoved back there, as if they were unwanted leftovers at their own daughter's celebration. I stood in the hallway, looking through the gap in the swinging doors. My dad quietly set the heavy basket of apples down in the corner by the wall and pulled out a metal stool for my mom to sit on. My mom kept her head down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the cold tile floor. They didn't complain. They didn't blame anyone. They just endured it in silence, as if they had spent their entire lives getting used to giving up their seats for others. My heart ached with every beat. The clinking of glasses outside continued joyfully. Someone loudly congratulated my husband, to our brilliant new managing director, to a bright future. Laughter erupted. Nobody paid a single thought to the back kitchen. That is, until my mother-in-law walked back. She stood right at the threshold of the kitchen doors, crossing her arms, her cold eyes, looking my parents up and down. That look wasn't curious, nor was it distant. It was unfiltered, undisguised contempt. "Move closer to the wall," she snapped, her voice low but piercing enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear. "Standing out here like this, you're in the caterer's way." My dad hurriedly stood up, pushing his stool closer to the prep table. My mom clumsily tried to do the same. I couldn't take it anymore. I marched swiftly toward the kitchen. "Mom, my parents are just..." Before I could finish, my mother-in-law whipped around, her voice suddenly spiking, echoing into the main hallway. "What are you trying to say? My house is packed. With all these important people here, you two get out to the kitchen and eat. What's the big deal?" Her words dropped like a thunderbolt. I clearly saw my mother's hands tremble. She bit her lip tightly, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. My dad stood paralyzed, his weathered face darkening, his shoulders slumping even lower. Around us, a few relatives turned their heads to look. Some pretended they didn't hear a thing. Others threw a quick glance and looked away, while a few smirked as if watching a reality show that had nothing to do with them. I turned to look at my husband. He was standing not far away, still holding his drink, avoiding my eyes. When I stared directly at him, waiting for him to step up and defend us, he merely furrowed his brow and lowered his voice. "Don't make a big deal out of this. Today is a happy day. A happy day." I let out a dry, breathy laugh from the back of my throat. A happy day for whom? A happy day for the man being toasted and praised, or for the VIPs sitting in the formal dining room, eating their fill, while my parents were pushed into the caterer's kitchen like servants? I took a deep breath. The atmosphere was so heavy you could hear the mechanical hum of the industrial exhaust fan spinning above the stove. My mother-in-law still stood there, a victorious glint in her eyes, as if she had just successfully taught someone a basic fact of life. And in that exact moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. If I swallowed this humiliation today, my parents would be treated like this for the rest of their lives. I looked back at my parents, then raised my head. The corners of my mouth curled into a very faint smile, a smile that surprised even me. It wasn't a smile begging for peace, nor a smile of endurance. It was the smile of someone who had decided to stand up. The air in the kitchen felt thick, a suffocating mix of grease, hot food, and the overwhelming noise of the party outside. It felt like standing in an airtight room, choking me. My mother-in-law stood there with her arms crossed, looking incredibly smug. She was entirely certain that, just like every time before, I would stay silent, endure it, and swallow my tears to keep the peace. But this time, she was dead wrong. I stepped forward and took my mother's hand. That hand was thin and callous from a lifetime of hard labor. When I touched her, she flinched, looking up at me with anxious eyes. "It's fine, honey, just leave it be. It's okay." My dad quickly whispered, "We can eat anywhere, sweetheart. Don't let people gossip about you." I looked at my parents, a wave of heartbreaking sorrow washing over me. They had lived their entire lives for their children. They had spent their entire lives terrified of being a burden. And today, they were being humiliated right in front of me. Yet all they cared about was keeping the peace for their daughter. I squeezed my mother's hand tighter. Mom, Dad, I said slowly, enunciating every single word, we are not eating here tonight. My voice wasn't a shout, but it was loud enough for the people nearby to hear. A relative turned around to stare. The laughter in the living room began to thin out. My mother-in-law froze for a second, then scowled. What did you just say? I stood up perfectly straight, gripping my parents' hands, and walked right out of the kitchen. In that split second, the entire living room seemed to move in slow motion. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. The chatter faded to a whisper. Curious eyes, judging eyes, eyes hungry for drama, they all locked onto us. Seeing me walk out, my husband's face immediately changed. He rushed over, lowering his voice into a harsh whisper. What are you doing? Whatever it is, we can talk about it later. Do not embarrass me in front of everyone. I looked at him. I looked closely at the man I had called my husband for years. The man currently being hailed as a brilliant executive. The man receiving endless toasts, and the man who had stood in absolute silence while my parents were chased into the kitchen. Embarrass you? I asked back, my voice remarkably calm. You watched my parents get kicked into the kitchen, and you weren't embarrassed? He stalled. Before he could formulate a response, my mother-in-law raised her voice. What kind of stunt are you pulling now? The house is full of guests. If you want to leave, leave later. Do not stand in the middle of my house and cause a scene. I turned to look at her, and this time, I didn't avoid her gaze. Don't worry, I said, my tone neither high nor low, but ringing crystal clear in the dead silent room. I'm not causing a scene. I am simply taking my parents out to dinner, to a place where they will be seated with dignity. A low murmur rippled through the crowd behind me. Someone whispered, wait, is she actually leaving? Someone else shook their head. What an arrogant daughter-in-law. I didn't care. I bent down, picked up the rustic basket of apples from the floor, and handed it to my dad. Hold this for me, Dad. Then I linked my arm through my mother's and guided her straight toward the front door. My parents were bewildered, their footsteps hesitant. Honey, please, I whispered back, just loud enough for them to hear. Let me handle it today. As the heavy oak door of my in-law's house swung open and the cool evening air rushed in, I heard my mother-in-law's furious voice behind my back. If you walk out that door, don't you dare come back. I paused for a half-second. I didn't turn around. I simply smiled and said, because I know I won't be the one making the calls. The massive door clicked shut behind us. It didn't make a loud noise, but in my heart, it sounded like the slamming shut of an entire era of submissive endurance that had lasted for years. Outside, the sky had already darkened. The suburban street was busy with passing luxury cars, the golden streetlights reflecting off the pavement. The air was much cooler than inside the stifling house. But my parents still walked slowly, looking embarrassed, like people who had just broken a major rule. My dad stopped, looking around, dropping his voice. So, where are we going now, sweetheart? My mom pulled my arm nervously. Maybe we should just go find a cheap motel for the night and figure things out tomorrow. Making a big scene like this. People are going to say you have no manners. I looked at my parents, two people who had lived simply their entire lives. So used to taking the short end of the stick, so used to swallowing their pride that being treated like dirt felt normal to them. I smiled, but my voice was absolute. We are not going to a motel. Tonight, I am taking you out to dinner. My dad looked surprised. Where? I didn't answer right away. I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady, entirely contrary to what my parents were thinking. I opened my contacts, scrolled past a few familiar names, and stopped at a number saved very simply. I hit call. It didn't even ring twice before a man answered. Yes, ma'am, I'm here. The young man's voice was deeply respectful, clearly not your average customer service representative. Tonight, I said crisply, prepare a private VIP room for me. 3 people. It's peak hour, ma'am. The man on the other end paused for exactly 1 second before instantly pivoting. Yes, of course. I will arrange it immediately. How soon will you arrive? 30 minutes. Understood. The VIP suite will be ready. I hung up. My parents stood there watching me, their eyes full of confusion. My mom asked softly, who did you just call? I linked my arm through hers, my voice softening completely. You'll see in a bit. We called an Uber Black. The sleek SUV rolled down the street, leaving behind the brightly lit mansion. The place where the party was still going. The place where people were still raising glasses, completely convinced I would never dare step far from that front door. Nobody spoke in the car. My dad stared out the window, the city lights flashing across his weathered face. My mom gripped my hand tightly, as if terrified I was doing something far beyond my means. The SUV pulled up in front of a massive, imposing building, downtown. The facade was brilliantly illuminated, the golden letters of the luxury five-star restaurant glowing in the night sky. My dad looked up and froze. Here? My mom's eyes went wide, her voice shaking. Honey, this is a five-star restaurant. I tipped the driver, helped my mom out of the car, and smiled. Yes, we're eating here. My parents hesitated outside the pristine glass doors, looking at the luxurious interior, the impeccably dressed staff, and the wealthy clientele walking in and out. Are you sure there's no mistake? My dad asked, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. I shook my head. At that exact moment, the automatic glass doors slid open. A man in a sharp black suit hurried out, bowing his head deeply. Madam, you've arrived. The room is fully prepared. Please, follow me. The extreme reverence in his tone left my parents speechless. My mom turned to me, a mix of fear and sheer shock in her eyes. Did he just call you? I just smiled, took their hands, and led them inside. Meanwhile, deep in my purse, my phone began to buzz. One call, then another. I didn't answer, because I knew that back at my in-laws' house, the chaos was just beginning. The heavy doors to the private suite closed, entirely cutting us off from the noisy, bustling atmosphere of the main dining room. Inside, soft golden light cascaded over a round table draped in pristine white linen. Warm water was already poured, the napkins folded with geometric precision. Every detail was so immaculately flawless that my parents just stood there, too intimidated to sit down. My mom looked around, dropping her voice to a whisper. Honey, things are going to be incredibly expensive in here. Maybe we should just order a little bit. My dad nodded in agreement. Just a bite so we don't look rude, and then we'll go home. We can eat whatever. I pulled out their chairs and smiled. Tonight, you eat whatever you want. Don't worry about the bill. I've got it. My mom hesitated. When you say that, it makes me worry even more. I didn't explain further. I just gently poured them some water and sat across from them, looking as entirely relaxed as if this were just a casual Tuesday dinner. A sommelier and head waiter stepped into the room, bowing respectfully. Madam, may I present the menu? Would you prefer your usual selections, or shall I have the executive chef prepare a tasting menu tailored for an easier palate for our esteemed older guests? My parents looked at each other in total bewilderment. I answered immediately. Please have him select dishes that are light, not too rich, prioritizing what's best for my parents. Right away, madam. The staff slipped out, leaving my parents sitting in silence for a long moment. My mom looked at me, her eyes strange and cautious. How do you know these people so well? I smiled gently. Let's eat first. I'll tell you everything after. The dishes began to arrive, each plate presented so beautifully that my dad gasped. They make it look so pretty. I feel bad ruining it with a fork. But after taking a bite, my mom nodded in approval. It's delicious. Not greasy at all. Watching them, the heavy weight in my chest lifted just a little. At least in this exact moment. My parents were sitting down to a proper meal, where nobody was chasing them away, and nobody was looking down on them. Right then, the phone in my purse buzzed again. Once, twice, then continuously. I glanced at the screen. My husband's name flashed. I took the phone out and placed it face down on the table. Less than a minute later, the screen lit up again. This time it was my mother-in-law, then a cousin from his side. I didn't pick up. My dad noticed and asked quietly, Is something wrong, sweetie? I shook my head. Nothing important. But the phone refused to stay quiet. It vibrated, lit up, vibrated again. My mom looked at me, worried. Maybe you should answer it. If they're calling this much, something must have happened. I remained perfectly calm. If it's something I need to hear, they will speak to me properly later. Right now, let's just enjoy our dinner. I said that, but deep down, I knew the truth. The atmosphere at my in-laws' house had undeniably shifted. The party had likely ground to a halt. My husband was probably being interrogated. My mother-in-law was starting to realize that things were terribly wrong. Someone used to barking orders at others cannot remain calm for long when they are suddenly, entirely ignored. The phone vibrated a few more times, then fell dead silent. I took a sip of water, watching my parents enjoy their food much more freely now, and thought to myself, give it one more hour. Those angry calls won't be reprimands anymore. They will be desperate pleas. Less than 10 minutes after the heavy oak door had closed behind me, the atmosphere at my in-laws' estate was no longer the same. The celebratory feast was still spread out on the tables. The food was still warm, the champagne flutes still half full, but the boisterous laughter had faded. Conversations dwindled, and people's eyes kept darting toward the front door where I had just walked out with my parents. My husband stood in the center of the living room, clutching his phone, his face growing paler with every unanswered ring. He had called me for the 10th time. Still no signal. A relative leaned in and muttered, "Hey, did your wife seriously just leave?" My husband nodded vaguely, trying to keep his voice casual. "She's just a little upset. She'll be back in a bit." But he didn't even believe his own words. My mother-in-law was sitting on the main sofa, her face stormy. She slammed her crystal water glass onto the table with a sharp clack. "What an insolent daughter-in-law," she fumed, unable to hide her rage. Walking out in the middle of a party, dragging her parents along with her. Absolutely shameless. An aunt chimed in to agree. Girls these days are spoiled rotten. She needs to be taught a lesson. But some of the guests were looking at things differently. An older uncle sitting near the door frowned. But let's be fair. Chasing your in-laws into the caterer's kitchen in the middle of a massive party. Who could stomach that? That comment was like a needle prick. My mother-in-law whipped around. "What are you implying? It's my house. I arranged the seating. Did I do something wrong?" The uncle didn't answer. He just shook his head. Right at that moment, my mother-in-law's cell phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, furrowing her brow. An unknown number. She answered, her tone still harsh. "Hello? Who is this?" The person on the other end spoke rapidly. Within seconds, the color drained entirely from my mother-in-law's face. The hand holding the phone began to visibly shake. Say that again?" she asked, her voice dropping. All the arrogance from a moment ago instantly evaporating. The entire living room fell silent. My husband rushed over. "Mom, what's going on?" My mother-in-law held up a hand, signaling him to be quiet, her eyes glued to nothingness as she listened. "That's impossible. You must be mistaken," she stammered. "How could this have anything to do with..." She hung up the phone. In that split second, she collapsed back against the sofa cushions, looking like someone had just drained every ounce of life from her body. "What happened?" my husband demanded, panic creeping into his voice. My mother-in-law looked at him, her eyes showing raw, unfiltered terror for the first time in her life. "The bank, the commercial lender just called. They said there is an immediate red flag on the corporate accounts. They demand an urgent verification." "Red flag? What red flag?" He scowled. "Our firm's financials are solid." My mother-in-law shook her head. "They wouldn't say. They just said it pertains to the primary anonymous backer." The air in the living room shifted instantly. Several guests began to whisper amongst themselves. A few stood up, making excuses to leave early. Others discreetly checked their watches, looking highly uncomfortable. My husband pulled out his phone and called his COO. It rang for a long time before someone picked up. "Hey, it's me. Is something happening at the firm?" The person on the other end spoke a very short sentence. My husband stood dead in his tracks. "What did you just say?" His voice pitched up. "They demanded to suspend the contract signings?" He hung up, turning to look at his mother. "Mom." The COO said several major partners suddenly halted all collaborations. They refused to give a reason. My mother-in-law swallowed hard. She looked around the massive living room, once filled with joyous celebration, now filled with anxious, probing faces. And for the first time in her life, she remembered a tiny, seemingly insignificant detail she had never cared about before. Her daughter-in-law, from the very beginning to the very end of the argument, had not yelled or argued back once. She had only smiled and walked away. Trembling, she picked up her phone and dialed my number. It rang, but nobody picked up. Night had fully fallen. The lights in the mansion were blazing, but no one had the mood to raise a glass anymore. The catered food grew cold. The vintage wine sat untouched. People made excuses to slip out the door, while those who stayed fidgeted in their seats, their eyes betraying deep anxiety. My husband collapsed onto the sofa, clutching his phone in both hands. He finished one call and immediately dialed my number again. It rang out. He checked his call log. 15 missed calls. 20. 30. Not a single response. My mother-in-law paced back and forth across the expensive rugs, her footsteps much more frantic than usual. She was no longer sitting in her grand chair giving orders or criticizing people. Her face was ashen, her lips pressed tightly together. Call her again, she urged, her voice stripped of its previous venom, replaced with sheer panic. Get her on the phone. My husband called, and called again. When his phone displayed 50 missed calls, true terror finally set in. He looked at his mother, his voice shaking. She has never ignored my calls like this before. That sentence made my mother-in-law freeze. It suddenly dawned on her. From the day I had married into this family, I had never raised my voice, never argued back, never caused a scene about anything. And yet today, I left swiftly and cleanly. No tears, no begging, no looking back. Her phone vibrated again. She jumped, but it wasn't me. It was a close family relative involved in their business. The voice was frantic. Listen, the partners just called me asking questions. They said they are reviewing all the contracts with our firm. My mother-in-law slumped into a chair. Reviewing what? She demanded. I don't know, the relative replied. They just said orders came down from the very top. Who is the top? She snapped out of habit. But the answer she received left her paralyzed. The kind of top we cannot touch. The phone slipped from my mother-in-law's hand and hit the floor. An aunt who saw it happen rushed over. Is it that bad? My mother-in-law swallowed heavily, shaking her head. I don't know. But deep in her gut, a terrifying realization was clawing its way up. My husband had now called nearly 80 times. He stared at the number on his screen, his hands shaking violently. Mom, is it possible? Is it possible? She isn't as simple as we thought. The question slipped out as a whisper, but in that dead silent room, it echoed like a gunshot. My mother-in-law didn't yell. She didn't scold him. She sat in silence for a very long time. Then she picked up her phone and dialed my number again. This time, her tone wasn't authoritative. When it went to voicemail again, she left an audio message, her voice audibly quivering. Honey, please come home so we can talk. Whatever it is, we can work it out slowly. Please, I'm begging you. After hitting send, she sat there in a daze. For the first time in her life, she understood a terrifying truth. There are some people in this world who, when they finally turn their backs in silence, make you realize you have insulted the absolute wrong person. Dinner was winding down. My dad leaned back in his plush chair, letting out a rare sigh of relief. My mom had stopped looking around the room with worry. Instead, she sat up straight, delicately picking at her food, no longer acting like she was terrified of dropping crumbs in a place she didn't belong. I looked at them, and my heart settled. At least for tonight, they were safe and at peace. I checked my phone. The screen lit up. 80 missed calls. My husband's name dominated the screen, interspersed with my mother-in-law, relatives, and unknown numbers. I wasn't surprised in the slightest. I placed the phone face down on the table again. My mom noticed and asked softly, They're calling so much. Are you really not going to answer? I smiled, my voice incredibly calm. It's not time yet, Mom. Right on cue, the phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't put it face down. I looked at the name on the screen, a very short, professional contact name. I stood up. Excuse me, I need to take this. I stepped out onto the private balcony, attached to the dining room. The cool night breeze carried the faint scent of flowers from the restaurant's rooftop garden. I answered the call. Yes? A middle-aged man's voice came through the line, deep and measured. Is everything all right on your end, ma'am? I answered directly, without beating around the bush. Fine. Everything is going exactly as planned. The man paused for a few seconds before continuing. They are in full panic mode on their end. The banks are calling them nonstop, and the corporate partners have frozen operations. I let out a soft moan. How far do you want to push this? The man asked. I looked through the glass doors. My parents were sitting together, chatting quietly. My mom was smiling a rare, incredibly gentle smile. I spoke slowly. No need to obliterate them yet. Just make sure they understand that everything they currently have is not something they can just toy with. Understood, the proxy replied. Whenever you are ready, just say the word. I hung up. Without another word, I walked back into the room. My dad looked up. Who was that? I pulled out my chair and sat down. Just an associate. My mom looked at me for a long time before finally asking the question she had been holding back since we walked into the restaurant. What exactly are you doing, honey? I was quiet for a moment. Then, I spoke in a voice just loud enough for them to hear. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just making sure no one ever looks down on you again. My dad looked at me, his eyes a mix of worry and deep pride, But he didn't ask any more questions. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text message. I glanced at the audio message from my mother-in-law. I could practically hear her hyperventilating through the text preview. "Honey, I know I misspoke. Please come home so we can talk." I didn't open it. I locked the screen, because I knew very well they would keep calling all night. And the next time I saw them, I would no longer be the submissive daughter-in-law standing in the kitchen. Dinner had long concluded. The waiter brought in hot artisan tea, set it gently on the table, and quietly slipped out. My parents sat next to each other, chatting softly about the food, acting as if the massive storm raging outside didn't exist. I checked my watch. It was nearing 10 p.m. The phone in my hand vibrated once more. This time, I didn't ignore it. My husband's name flashed brightly, accompanied by the notification of 83 missed calls. I stood up. "I'm going to take this." I walked to the far side of the room, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the parking valet below. The headlights reflected off the wet pavement like shattered glass. I pressed answer. "Hello," just one short word. But on the other end of the line, my husband practically shattered. "Where are you?" he demanded, his voice frantic and hoarse. "Why haven't you been answering? Do you have any idea what a disaster it is here?" I stayed silent for a few seconds. Then, I asked, completely deadpan, "Are you looking for me because you're worried about me, or because your family is in trouble?" He choked on his words. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "I'm your husband. Of course I'm worried about you." I let out a small, quiet, but utterly freezing laugh. "If you were worried about me," I said slowly, "then when your mother told my parents to go eat in the kitchen, you wouldn't have stood there in silence." The shouting on the other end ceased. All that was left was heavy breathing. There were so many people. "I didn't think it would turn into this," he said, his voice weakening. "Turn into what?" I pressed. "The corporate partners pulling their contracts. Or the bank calling nonstop." He was stunned. You know everything? How do you think I know?" I shot back. Silence. Then, he dropped his voice into a desperate plea. "Please, just come home. We can sit down and talk this out as husband and wife. My mom is terrified. She asked me to tell you to please just stop." I cut him off, my voice not loud but absolute. "I am not coming back. At least, not to apologize." He choked back a sob. "You're taking this way too far. My career, this managing director position, this isn't a game." I looked down at my hand. It was perfectly steady. "You know what?" I said, pronouncing every syllable with lethal clarity. "I never intended to ruin your career, but I also never realized your precious position was so fragile." A long silence followed. Over the speaker, I could clearly hear him swallow hard. Who exactly are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer him directly. I only said one soft sentence. "You just need to remember one thing. Everything you have today is not something you get to use to look down on my parents." With that, I hung up. Without giving him a chance to say another word, I returned to the table. My mom looked at me. She didn't ask anything. She just gave a tiny nod, as if she already understood part of the puzzle. I sat down and picked up my teacup. Inside, I felt completely at peace. Because I knew that, from this second onward, the one panicking was no longer me. The call had just ended. My husband stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at his phone. Nobody dared to speak. My mother-in-law sat perfectly still on the sofa, her fingers woven tightly together. She wasn't pacing anymore. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't throwing out insults. On her face, for the first time, was an incredibly foreign emotion, the sheer terror of losing everything. My mother-in-law spoke first, her voice raspy. She said she's not coming back. She stared at the polished hardwood floor, where just hours ago there had been dancing and laughter. No one remembered exactly when the party officially died, only that the house was now terrifyingly empty. "Did you say anything else to her?" she asked softly, all her volume gone. "I tried," my husband replied, "but she sounded so different, Mom." It didn't sound like she was throwing a temper tantrum. My mother-in-law closed her eyes. A close uncle cautiously spoke up. Maybe we should go over and apologize to her parents first. We were definitely out of line today." If someone had said that a few hours ago, my mother-in-law would have bitten their head off. But this time, she didn't react with anger. She just let out a heavy sigh. "An apology? I'm afraid an apology won't be enough." Everyone exchanged looks. "What do you mean by that?" an aunt asked. My mother-in-law hesitated for a long time, then spoke slowly. Earlier, the commercial lender mentioned a name. The room went dead silent. A name I never thought I'd hear again. My husband looked up. What name, Mom? My mother-in-law swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a whisper. They asked if your wife had any connection to the anonymous private equity backer who bailed our company out a few years ago. The air in the room froze solid. My husband was paralyzed. The anonymous backer? The older uncle furrowed his brow. What are you talking about? That was settled years ago, wasn't it? My mother-in-law opened her eyes, filled with dread. Exactly. I thought it was settled, so I stopped worrying about it. She turned to her son. Do you remember when the firm almost filed for bankruptcy? Before you got this promotion, we were drowning in debt. The banks were foreclosing on everything. My husband nodded. Of course, I remember. If that angel investor hadn't signed the guarantor papers out of nowhere, we would have gone under. And did you ever find out who that investor was? She asked. He shook his head. They use an LLC. They signed the papers through a proxy and vanished. My mother-in-law let out a hollow laugh. Exactly. And the bank just asked me if my daughter-in-law was the principal behind that LLC. Deathly silence descended upon the mansion. A cousin gasped. That's impossible. Your daughter-in-law is so normal. Because she's so normal, my mother-in-law said, her voice shaking. I never paid attention. My husband dropped back into his chair. In his mind, the pieces of the puzzle began violently snapping together. Her unnatural calmness, her smile as she left the house. The calls from the bank, the partners pulling out, and her final sentence on the phone. He whispered, If it really is her. My mother-in-law looked at her son, and for the first time in her life, she didn't dare raise her voice. Tomorrow, she commanded weakly, you must find out where she is staying. Not to demand she comes back, not to yell at her, to go and beg for a civilized conversation. She paused, then continued, her voice breaking. Because if we really just insulted the absolute wrong person, the price we pay will cost us a lot more than a dinner party. Miles away, in the serene quiet of the five-star hotel attached to the restaurant, I poured more tea for my parents. Out there, the hurricane had just made landfall, but I knew perfectly well that what they were currently facing was only the preamble to the truth. The next morning, I woke up very early. The early sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating a spacious but wonderfully quiet suite. My parents were still asleep. My mom lay on her side, one hand resting on her chest, breathing steadily. My dad faced the window, his sleeping posture careful and contained, as he had been his whole life. I got up, poured a glass of water, and watched them for a long time. I knew today was going to be a different kind of day. Around 8 a.m., my phone buzzed. It wasn't my husband's number. It wasn't an unknown number. It was a short text message. I am down in the lobby. I am begging for a moment to speak with you and your parents. I read it and didn't reply immediately. I went back into the bedroom and gently woke my parents. My mom, still half asleep, asked, Is something wrong, honey? I smiled. Someone wants to see you. My dad sat up, instinctively adjusting his collar, the lifelong habit of a man who never wanted to impose on anyone. Is it your in-laws? I nodded. My mom fell silent. After a moment, she sighed softly. Well, we should probably hash things out clearly. We headed down to the lobby. The morning atmosphere in the luxury hotel was hushed and elegant. The concierge stood tall behind the marble desk, the ambient lighting glowing softly. My mother-in-law was sitting on a sofa near the glass doors. She was wearing a simple outfit, minimal makeup, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. All traces of the loud, domineering matriarch who had commanded the room the day before were completely gone. When she saw us approaching, she shot up from the couch. But then she stopped. Her eyes met my parents', and she immediately looked down at her shoes. Not out of politeness, but because she literally lacked the courage to look her in-laws in the eye. She spoke first, her voice raspy. I know I came too early. Please forgive me. My dad nodded, very slowly. It's fine. 2 words, but enough to make the air drop 10 degrees. My mom sat down on a chair, placing her purse neatly beside her. She didn't glare at my mother-in-law, nor did she act annoyed. But she also completely lacked the submissive, terrified posture from the day before. I sat opposite her. Nobody spoke for several agonizing seconds. Finally, my mother-in-law broke the silence. Yesterday was my fault. Her voice echoed slightly in the grand lobby. She bowed her head. I said things I never should have said. I was foolish. I looked down on others. I didn't respond. Neither did my parents. She gripped her hands tightly and continued. I apologize to you both. I am so sorry for hurting you. This time she looked at my parents, but she couldn't hold eye contact for more than a second. My mom looked at her for a long time, then spoke. Her voice was light but incredibly clear. We don't need you to apologize to us just for our sake. My mother-in-law jerked her head up in surprise. My mom continued. Just promise that from now on, you will never look down on anyone, especially not your daughter-in-law's parents. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold her. But every word hit exactly where it needed to. My mother-in-law nodded frantically. Yes, I understand. She turned to me, her voice shrinking. Can I speak with you in private for a moment? I looked at her. I didn't see the familiar tyrant anymore. I only saw a woman terrified of losing everything she thought was her absolute right to possess. No need for privacy, I replied. Whatever it is, you can say it here. She stalled, then nodded. Okay, the firm. She hesitated. Was that your doing? I neither confirmed nor denied it. I simply said, I didn't do anything drastic. I just put everything back to where it belongs. She swallowed hard. Can you stop it? I looked directly into her eyes for the first time since we met. That depends entirely on whether, after today, everyone actually understands what they did wrong. Silence fell over us. My mother-in-law sat perfectly still for a long time. Finally, she whispered, there are some people you really just shouldn't underestimate. I stood up. My parents need to rest. We can discuss other matters later. My mother-in-law also stood up, taking a step back. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to say this. As we turned away, I knew with absolute certainty that the power dynamic in this relationship had fundamentally, irreversibly changed. Just as we stood up, the sound of frantic footsteps echoed from the lobby entrance. My husband appeared. His dress shirt was heavily wrinkled, his tie yanked to the side, his face betraying sheer exhaustion after a sleepless night. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw his mother standing in front of my parents, not yelling, not giving orders, but bowing her head far lower than usual. He froze. It was a sight he had probably never expected to witness in his entire life. His mother spoke to him, her voice thick and gravelly. You're here. There was no commanding tone of a matriarch, just the exhaustion of a beaten mother. My husband turned to look at my parents. My dad was standing perfectly straight, his hands behind his back, his eyes serene. My mom was sitting quietly, composed, no longer avoiding eye contact, and no longer acting like a frightened mouse in a kitchen. He bowed his head, very slowly. I am so sorry. Those 3 words were harder to say than he ever imagined. It is my fault, he continued, dropping his voice. Yesterday, I failed to protect you. I looked at him. I felt no joy, no vindication. Just a massive, gaping distance between us. My dad nodded. It's in the past, but there are some things that should never be allowed to repeat themselves. My mom added, her voice still gentle, we don't need anyone to apologize for our pride. We just need to be respected. My husband swallowed hard. He turned to me. Can we please go home and talk? I shook my head. Not today. He panicked. Then when? I looked him dead in the eye, unflinching. When you fully understand one fact, you are my husband, but first and foremost, I am my parents' daughter. That sentence rooted him to the spot. My mother-in-law looked at her son, then at me. Finally, she said, she is right. She turned back to my parents. Today, I would like to formally invite you to a proper lunch. Not to buy my way out of an apology, but to show my genuine respect. My dad looked at my mom. She gave a slight nod. We accept. But we accept as the parents of our daughter, not as guests banished to the caterer's kitchen. My mother-in-law bowed her head again. Understood. Lunch that afternoon took place in a completely different atmosphere. No one sat higher than anyone else. There was no head of the table or kids' table. No disdainful glares or judgmental side eyes. My parents sat with their backs straight, speaking slowly and thoughtfully. My husband quietly served food to my parents, every movement cautious and calculated, as if he were relearning how to be a decent human being. As for me, I simply observed, because deep down, a final decision was taking shape. After lunch, I stood up. I'm going to take my parents back to their room to rest. My husband followed me, pleading, please don't leave me. I turned back and looked at him for a long time. I'm not leaving, I said. I'm just not returning to where I used to be. He understood. And for the first time, I saw in his eyes not anger, but the genuine terror of losing me. The afternoon passed slowly. My parents had gone to their room to rest. The door clicked shut softly, but to me, it felt like an invisible boundary had been drawn, a boundary between what I used to accept and what I would never accept again. My husband stood out in the hotel hallway. He waited. He didn't knock. He didn't try to grab my arm. He just stood there like a man who realized he had been standing on the wrong side of history for far too long. I stepped out. I want to talk. He spoke first, his voice deep and urgent. Tell me everything. I'll listen. I nodded. We sat down in a small private lounge area at the end of the hall. No one else was around. No mother-in-law, no parents. Just two people who used to be husband and wife. What are you going to do next? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked, if I hadn't stood up and walked my parents out yesterday, did you ever plan on apologizing to them? He remained silent. That silence was my answer. Then, I said slowly, don't ask me what I'm going to do. You should be asking if we are even on the same side anymore. He looked up quickly. I choose you. I looked him dead in the eye. No, you don't. He froze. You choose me. I continued. When you have the courage to stand by my side in the hardest moments. Not just when you're about to lose everything. He dropped his head, intertwining his fingers. I made a mistake, but I can fix it. You can fix a mistake once, I replied. But can you fix a lifetime of habit? He had no answer. Right then, my dad stepped out of the suite. He hadn't been eavesdropping. He just noticed we had been talking for a long time. He walked over. He gestured for us to stay seated. He looked at my husband for a long time, no blame, no harsh words. Just the gaze of a man who had lived through most of a lifetime. Do you know, my dad began, his voice deep and deliberate, why I didn't say anything yesterday? My husband shook his head. Because I wanted to see, my dad continued, if you knew where you stood. That made my husband flinch. My dad spoke every word with absolute clarity. Being a husband isn't about standing in the middle to keep the peace. Being a husband is about picking the right side, even if that side pisses other people off. The lounge was dead silent. My daughter. My dad looked over at me. Grew up working hard. She didn't get married so she could upgrade her lifestyle. All she ever needed was a man who wouldn't let her parents be treated like dirt. He looked back at my husband. If you can do that, then this family has a future. But if you can't, he paused for a beat, then letting go early is best for both of you. My husband said nothing. After a long silence, he finally stood up and bowed his head deeply. I understand. No excuses. No begging. Just two words. I looked at him. I wasn't angry anymore, nor did I have any blind hope left. I was just completely lucid. I turned to my dad. Thank you, Dad. He nodded. As I walked away, I knew with absolute certainty that after today, nothing would ever go back to normal. But precisely because of that, I could finally move forward without having to bow my head to anyone. That night, I sat alone by the window in my suite. Outside, the city lights were a dazzling array of neon, the streets bustling, looking as though the world was carrying on as normal. Except for me, everything had turned to a new page. My husband stood behind me, keeping a respectful distance. Have you thought this through? He asked, his voice exhausted but sincere. I didn't turn around. I thought it through the second you stood silently in that kitchen. He clenched his fists. I can change. I'll stand by your side. I'll lay down the law with my mother. I turned to look at him. No anger, no blame. I just didn't believe him anymore. You're right, I replied. You might change. But I do not want to spend the rest of this marriage waiting to see if you actually have the guts to do it. He froze. You want a divorce? I nodded, without a shred of hesitation. I am not leaving you because of money or status, I said, my voice perfectly calm. I am leaving because I refuse to spend my life teaching other people how to respect my parents. He slumped down into an armchair. After a long time, he spoke, his voice completely broken. I lost. He didn't lose because of corporate power. He didn't lose because of money. He lost because he had chosen the wrong side for far too long. The next morning, I took my parents out for breakfast. This time, no one was leading the way, no one was forced to sit in the back. It was just the three of us, chatting and laughing like a true family. My mom looked at me and asked softly, "Are you sad?" I shook my head. I'm only sad that I put up with it for so long. My dad placed a hand on my shoulder. Knowing when to walk away is true strength. On the other side of the city, my in-laws were beginning to pay the price. No massive scandals, no public screaming matches in the press, but enough to make them realize that the power and status they thought was their divine right was actually incredibly fragile. My mother-in-law called me one last time. "Honey, I don't dare ask you to come back," she said, her voice sounding incredibly tired. "I just hope you don't hate us." I answered very gently. "I don't hate you, but I'm also not coming back." The call ended. I turned off my phone. I looked at my parents walking slowly ahead of me. Two silhouettes that had walked side by side for nearly a lifetime, and for the first time, they were walking next to their daughter without having to keep their heads down. I knew from this day forward, I didn't need a marriage to prove my worth. And my parents would never again be the people shoved into anyone's back kitchen. I couldn't sleep that night. Not out of sadness, and not out of regret. It was because fragments of memories were slowly replaying in my mind. They were so incredibly clear, as if for the first time, I finally had the emotional distance to look at the whole picture from beginning to end without constantly making excuses for everyone else. The room was quiet. The wall clock ticked rhythmically. My parents had gone to bed early, falling into a sleep much deeper and more peaceful than in the days prior. I knew that ever since we left that mansion, a heavy weight had been lifted off their chests, even if they didn't say it out loud. I sat by the window, staring at the distant city skyline. The towering skyscrapers, the brilliant lights, the people rushing out there. Those were all the things that once made me believe I had to swallow my pride. That I had to endure to keep the peace, to avoid looking inferior, to prove I was worthy of being a high society wife. But sitting here now, I suddenly realized that all of those things were infinitely smaller than my parents' dignity. I remembered that afternoon. My dad standing silently in the caterer's kitchen, my mom keeping her head down, and my husband just staying silent. That silence wasn't loud, but it was heavier than any screamed insult. Some wounds don't come from people saying too much. They come from the deafening silence of the people who were supposed to protect you. I asked myself, if I hadn't stood up that day, if I had chosen to stay silent too, where would my parents sit 10, 20 years from now at the next family event? In the kitchen again, or in some forgotten corner where no one would even notice them? I took a deep breath. For the first time, I saw with absolute clarity that I hadn't lost anything at all. On the contrary, I had just escaped a life where I constantly had to ask for permission just to be respected. When the morning sun streamed into the room, I woke up feeling entirely different. No panic, no heaviness in my chest. Just a bizarre, overwhelming sense of relief, like someone who had finally put down a crushing burden they had been carrying for years without even realizing it. My dad was brewing coffee. My mom was preparing breakfast. Completely mundane tasks. But in that scene, I saw something I hadn't seen clearly before. My parents were taking their time. They were no longer afraid. My mom looked at me and asked a very gentle question. "Do you have any regrets?" I shook my head. I didn't even need to think. "No, Mom." She stayed quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Then that is enough." Just 4 words. But I understood that it wasn't just an answer to me. It was an answer to all the years she had swallowed her pride for her daughter's sake. I walked back to my room and checked my phone. One unread text from my soon-to-be ex-husband. It was very short. "I am so sorry I realized it too late." I stared at those words for a long time, then locked the screen. Not out of spite, but because I understand that some apologies, when delivered on time, are healing. But when they arrive too late, they are nothing more than an ending. And for me, this chapter was finally closed. Our new house wasn't a mansion. It was just a modest, cozy house tucked away in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. In the mornings, you could hear the birds. In the afternoons, the sun filtered through the oak trees in the front yard. It wasn't a place that made people gasp in awe. But the moment you walked in, I knew my parents would finally be able to breathe. On moving day, my mom wiped down the edges of every counter meticulously. Not because they were dirty, but because she was used to keeping her hands busy. My dad arranged a few potted plants they had brought all the way from the farm. He worked, occasionally looking up at the sky, as if checking to see if this place was peaceful enough to stay long-term. "This house is small," my dad noted, his tone utterly relaxed, "but it works." Just those few words. But I knew that to my dad, it works meant he didn't have to bow his head to live here. In the days that followed, life slowed down. In the mornings, my dad would wake up early, open the front door, and water the plants. He didn't have to check the clock. He didn't have to rush. Some days, he would just stand there for a long time, admiring a new leaf sprouting, smiling to himself. My mom would cook. She wasn't cooking to meet someone else's strict schedule. She wasn't cooking in fear that someone would complain about the seasoning. She cooked exactly how she liked it, for her own family. Some days, she'd make something incredibly simple, like a grilled cheese and soup, but she'd still call me into the kitchen to eat, terrified I was working too much and forgetting my meals. One afternoon, as we were all eating lunch, my mom suddenly said, "It's been a long time since I ate a meal without feeling like I was choking on it." I froze. My dad set his fork down, looked at my mom for a long time, and nodded. "Yeah, it's been a long time." Nobody elaborated, but all three of us understood. For years, no matter how rich the food was at those fancy tables, there was always something lodged in their throats that just wouldn't go down. In the evenings, my mom liked to sit on the porch and fold laundry. She wasn't doing it out of extreme frugality. She was just used to a simple life. But this time, I saw something entirely new in her, a sense of absolute leisure. No more defensive posture. No more looking over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't offending anyone. She did everything slowly, as if she finally had the time to live for herself. One day, a neighbor walked by and asked, "Oh, do you have your daughter living with you?" My mom smiled, her voice incredibly light. "Yes, that's my daughter." She didn't need to explain further. She didn't need to brag. Just that. But in her voice, I heard a pride she had rarely dared to show before. At night, we would all sit and watch TV. My dad would usually fall asleep halfway through the show. My mom would drape a light throw blanket over him. It was a familiar routine, but this time, it lacked the anxious tension it used to have. I sat there looking at them, and a realization hit me that made my heart sink. It turned out, what my parents needed all these years was just a place where they could be at peace. They didn't need wealth. They didn't need to be better than anyone else. They just needed to not be treated like dirt. Before bed, my mom came into my room and whispered, "Don't worry about us anymore. Having this, I feel like I have enough." I held her hand. "I'm sorry, I let you suffer so much for so long." She shook her head. "It wasn't your fault. We just endured it for too long." That night, I lay in bed listening to the wind brush against the window. My heart was completely at peace. I knew there were still legalities to sort out, but at the very least, my parents would never again be the people shoved into someone else's kitchen, and to me, that alone was a total victory. After that day, my in-laws never mentioned making a scene again. The barrage of phone calls stopped. The demanding text messages ceased. No one dared to utter the phrase, "She'll have to come crawling back eventually." Everything went incredibly quiet. But it was that exact silence that was the most suffocating. My ex-husband started going into the office later than usual. He no longer carried himself with the arrogant confidence of a rising executive. The endless board meetings, the constant furrowing of his brow, and the times he just stood staring blankly at his phone, it was as if he was waiting for something to return that never would. His managing director title was technically still there, but the actual power behind it had vanished. The corporate partners he used to golf with started speaking to him much more cautiously. Some used the excuse of reevaluating quarterly plans, while others would set meetings only to cancel them. The lavish country club galas that were once packed to the brim now only had a few familiar faces, and everyone was walking on eggshells. My mother-in-law noticed the shift very early on. She didn't say it out loud, but I know she understood exactly why the winds had changed so violently. One afternoon, she visited my ex-husband at his corporate office. Not to yell at him, but to ask one very quiet question. "Are you still in contact with her?" He shook his head. She sat down in a leather chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows, her voice dropping. "In the past, I always thought she was quiet because she was weak." She let out a dry laugh. "Turns out, the quietest people are the most dangerous ones, precisely because they don't feel the need to say a word." He didn't reply, because he had just figured that out for himself. During family dinners, that once boisterous mansion became hauntingly empty. No one spoke loudly anymore. No one showed off. The endless conversations revolving around money, status, and country club gossip faded away, replaced by long, uncomfortable silences. Once, a visiting relative blurted out, "So, how is the ex-wife doing these days?" My mother-in-law put her fork down and spoke very slowly. "She is doing well." For words. And absolutely no one dared to ask anything else. Because everyone understood, sometimes, someone simply living well is the heaviest retaliation of all. On my end, I didn't hear any more news about them. Not because they weren't struggling, but because no one felt they had the right to tell me about it anymore. That evening, as I was sitting with my parents, my mom asked, "Are those people still bothering you?" I shook my head. "No, Mom." My dad nodded, speaking very slowly. "So, they finally get it." I looked at him. "Get what?" "They get that not everyone who stays quiet is a pushover. Not everyone who endures things is powerless. And not every family can be treated like garbage without a price to pay." I slept beautifully that night. No dreams. Because for the first time in a very long time, I knew with absolute certainty that my life had finally turned toward a completely different horizon. My life eventually settled back into a familiar rhythm. No drama. No massive upheavals. Just everything falling into its proper place. In the mornings, I walked with my parents around the neighborhood. My dad loved the tree-lined sidewalks. My mom loved checking out the local farmers market stalls. Their conversations were incredibly mundane. The oak tree is getting new leaves. The soup yesterday was a little salty, but to me, that was the most beautiful sound in the world. I went back to managing my investments. No one asked me whose wife I was anymore. No one looked at me with calculating eyes. I worked based entirely on my own merits, signed executive decisions without having to stand in anyone's shadow, and left the office every evening feeling like I didn't owe a performance to anyone. A curious acquaintance once whispered, "Aren't you going to explain yourself? At least let people know who you really are." I laughed. "I know who I am. That's enough." Because I knew very well. When you live a good enough life, the explanation provides itself. Or it simply becomes irrelevant. One night, I got a text from an old socialite friend. "I hear you're so different now." I stared at the text for a long time. Different? I didn't think I was different. I just refused to accept being put in the wrong place anymore. Unlike before, I was no longer terrified of how outsiders looked at me. I wasn't scared of losing face, of not being tactful, or of not knowing my place. I realized those fears only exist when you give them permission to exist. One evening, while having dinner with my parents, my mom put a piece of baked salmon on my plate and said, "Looking at you now, I finally have peace of mind." My dad nodded. "You don't need to prove anything to anybody. You are living right." Those two sentences were worth more to me than 1,000 compliments. That night, I stood in front of the mirror looking at myself. No heavy designer makeup, no exhaustion I was desperately trying to hide. Just an ordinary woman who finally learned that she is not allowed to trade her self-respect for fake stability. I turned off the light and laid down. My mind was completely clear of what-ifs and should-haves. There was only one crystal-clear certainty. In this life, I would never again turn back to beg anyone for a seat at the table. And that was how I started my new life. It rained lightly that afternoon. It wasn't a torrential downpour, just a gentle drizzle that cooled the suburban asphalt, washing away the dust and the rush of the day. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the rain hit the porch, feeling a very natural sense of peace wash over me. Dinner that night was nothing extravagant. A hot bowl of soup, some roasted chicken, a plate of steamed vegetables. Simple dishes my mom cooked out of habit, not needing to ask who liked it or who hated it. She just cooked because it was our family's meal. My dad sat down at the table first, deliberately arranging his silverware. My mom brought the soup pot over and said softly, "Let's eat, honey. We don't have to wait for anyone. We don't have to watch anyone's face." We sat eating to the steady rhythm of the rain outside, the only sound inside being the soft clinking of spoons against bowls. I looked at my parents, my dad sitting tall with a straight back, my mom with her gentle, peaceful smile, and I suddenly realized that this right here was the exact thing I had wanted to protect from the very beginning. Mid-meal, my mom suddenly spoke up. Back then, when they told us to go eat in the kitchen, I wasn't angry. I stopped chewing. I was just sad, she continued, her voice slow, noticing my silence. I looked down. My dad set his fork down and said very softly, "But you stood up, and that was enough." Those words made my throat tighten. I looked at the two people who had endured an entire lifetime of hardship for me, and I finally understood something I had never dared to think about before. Some marriages, if they require the sacrifice of your parents' dignity, are better off not existing at all. My mom put another piece of chicken on my plate, smiling warmly. "Everything is good now. A small house is perfectly fine, as long as nobody here has to bow their head." Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside this house, the warmth was unparalleled. I suddenly recalled the arrogant glares from that day, the vicious words thrown across the party, and the exact moment I took my parents' hands and walked out of those heavy oak doors. If I could go back in time to that exact moment, I would do it all over again. Because the second I chose to stand by my parents, life automatically chose to stand by me. I lifted my bowl and smiled. "Eat up, Mom, Dad. The soup is getting cold." My dad nodded and slowly said a sentence that I will remember for the rest of my life. "A house doesn't need to be a mansion. It just needs to have enough room for your dignity." I understand that my story is not about winning or losing. It is the story of a daughter learning how to stand tall and of a family finally getting to sit and eat in their rightful place. Outside, the rain gradually stopped, and inside my heart, everything was finally, truly at peace. The takeaway. This story isn't about victory or defeat, nor is it meant to teach anyone how to be superior to others. It serves to remind us of one very simple truth. Never trade your dignity just to keep the peace. Never let the label of family be an excuse to let someone disrespect your parents. Some of the deepest pain doesn't come from shouted insults. It comes from the silence of the very person who was supposed to stand up and protect you. Whether you are a wife, a husband, or a child, ultimately, you must remember one thing. If a marriage forces your parents to bow their heads, it is no longer happiness. It is simply endurance, packaged under the guise of family. You don't need to be better than anyone else in this life. You just need to stand in your proper place and ensure the people you love are never pushed into the wrong one. Because a house doesn't need to be a mansion. It just needs to have enough room for your dignity. If this story touched your heart, if you have ever stayed silent for the sake of your family, or if you have ever stood up to protect your parents, please like this video to help spread this message. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and share this video with anyone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the Evening Reflections channel to join us in listening to more everyday, gentle, yet profoundly real stories about family, marriage, and human character. Thank you for staying with us until the very final minutes of this story. We will see you in the next chapter here on Family Shadows.